In the bustling streets of Jaidandawa, a quiet village in northern Nigeria, the nights came alive with the irresistible aroma of freshly grilled suya. The villagers, traders, and travelers from distant towns lined up near the suya stand of a mysterious man known simply as Malam Sani. Tall, dark, and silent, Malam Sani never spoke a word to his customers, not even to exchange pleasantries. Instead, he would nod or gesture to indicate prices and quantities. Yet, despite his reticence, his suya was considered the best anyone had ever tasted. The suya was always tender, flavorful, and spiced to perfection. The spice blend was a closely guarded secret that no one could replicate, though many had tried. Even the wealthiest patrons of Jaidandawa would send their servants late at night to ensure they got a taste of Malam Sani's suya. It wasn't just food. It was an experience, a culinary masterpiece that people swore by. Yet Malam Sani himself remained an enigma. Unlike other suya sellers who laughed and chatted with customers, he stood silently by his stand, focused solely on his craft. He arrived at the marketplace as dusk fell and left before dawn, his cart always spotless, his tools meticulously arranged. No one knew where he lived, how he prepared his meat, or even if he had family. His quiet demeanor made him the subject of endless speculation. Some believed Malam Sani was simply a man of few words, a master chef who had honed his craft to perfection. Others whispered darker theories. They spoke of charms and strange rituals, claiming that no ordinary man could grill suya with such unmatched flavor. A few even swore they had seen strange lights flickering in the distance behind his stand late at night. Despite the whispers, people kept coming. The allure of Malam Sani's suya was too powerful to resist, and Jaidandawa's marketplace thrived because of his presence. Among the suya enthusiasts was Amina, a widowed mother of 3 who sold yams in the market. Her children adored suya, and every Friday night, she would buy some as a treat for them. Amina admired Malam Sani's skill but found his silence unsettling. How can a man who feeds the entire village not utter a single word? She often wondered. One Friday evening, as Amina joined the queue, she noticed something peculiar. A young boy, no older than 10, dropped a few naira notes at Malam Sani's stand and pointed to the smallest portion of suya. Malam Sani nodded and handed him the suya. But instead of leaving, the boy lingered, staring at Malam Sani with wide, curious eyes. "Malam, where do you get your meat from?" the boy asked innocently, his voice cutting through the evening chatter. Malam Sani froze. For a fleeting moment, his hand hovered mid-air as he reached for another skewer. The small crowd fell silent, their attention drawn to the rare interaction. Slowly, Malam Sani straightened up and fixed his gaze on the boy. His dark eyes, cold and piercing, seemed to pierce through the boy's soul. Without a word, he pointed toward the horizon, where the vast bushland stretched endlessly into the night. The boy, unnerved by the intensity of Malam Sani's stare, nodded quickly and scurried away with his suya. The crowd laughed nervously and resumed their chatter, but Amina couldn't shake the feeling that something about the exchange was deeply unsettling. Later that night, as Amina served her children the suya, she noticed an unusual smell. It wasn't the typical smoky aroma she was accustomed to, but something sharper, almost metallic. Her youngest son, Bala, bit into a piece and made a face. "Mama, this suya tastes funny," he said, pushing the plate away. Amina frowned and tasted it herself. The flavor was off. The spices were overpowering, almost as if they were masking something else. She set the plate aside and decided not to give it to her children, though she didn't want to waste it. The next morning, as she set up her yam stall, she overheard a heated conversation between 2 women in the market. "I'm telling you, that suya wasn't right last night," one of them exclaimed. "My husband said the same thing. The taste was different, and he's been feeling sick ever since." Amina's ears perked up. Could it have been the suya? She hesitated, torn between dismissing it as coincidence and investigating further. Her instincts told her something wasn't right, but she didn't want to stir trouble unnecessarily. That evening, curiosity got the better of her. She decided to keep watch on Malam Sani's stand from a distance. As the crowd around his stall dwindled and the marketplace grew quieter, she noticed something odd. Malam Sani wasn't packing up as he usually did. Instead, he pulled out a large burlap sack from beneath his cart and disappeared into the bush. Amina's heart raced. Where was he going with that sack so late at night? Summoning her courage, she followed him, keeping a safe distance. The moonlight cast long shadows on the path as she trailed him into the dense bush. Her footsteps were light, but her heart pounded loudly in her chest. Malam Sani moved with purpose, seemingly unbothered by the darkness or the eerie sounds of the night. Finally, he stopped at a clearing. Amina crouched behind a tree, her breath shallow as she watched him open the sack. What she saw next made her blood run cold. Amina crouched in the shadows, her heart racing as she watched Malam Sani reach into the burlap sack. The clearing was dimly lit by a faint moonlight filtering through the dense canopy of trees, casting eerie shadows that danced with the faint rustling of the leaves. Malam Sani pulled out a large, bloodied object wrapped in layers of cloth. Amina squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Her breath hitched as he unwrapped the cloth, revealing what looked like raw meat. But something about it seemed wrong. It was larger than any cut she had ever seen, and its shape was unnatural. It didn't look like beef, goat, or any other meat she was familiar with. Her hands began to tremble as a chilling realization crept into her mind. Could it be human? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought, but the unease in her gut refused to subside. Malam Sani worked methodically, his movements precise and deliberate. He gathered dry sticks from the ground and started a fire. The crackling flames illuminated his face, casting long shadows that made his features even more haunting. He placed a large flat stone over the fire, then began slicing the meat with a curved knife that gleamed ominously in the flickering light. Amina stifled a gasp as she watched him season the meat with the same blend of spices that had made his suya so famous. The familiar aroma wafted through the air, but now it carried a sinister undertone that made her stomach churn. She realized with horror that this was where he prepared his suya, far away from the prying eyes of the marketplace. Malam Sani's silence made the scene even more unsettling. He worked as though possessed, completely focused on his task. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the rhythmic slicing of the knife, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Suddenly, Amina heard a noise behind her, a twig snapping underfoot. Her heart leapt into her throat as she turned, fearing she had been discovered. But to her relief, it was just a stray goat wandering through the bush. She let out a quiet sigh and turned her attention back to Malam Sani, only to find that he was now staring directly at her hiding spot. Her blood ran cold. Had he seen her? She held her breath, frozen in place, as his piercing gaze seemed to scan the darkness. After a long, tense moment, he returned to his work, but Amina knew she couldn't stay any longer. She needed to leave before he noticed her for real. Moving as quietly as possible, she began to retreat, her eyes never leaving him. But just as she turned to flee, her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, crashing to the ground. The noise was loud enough to shatter the eerie silence of the night. Malam Sani's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto her. This time there was no doubt he had seen her. He stood slowly, the curved knife glinting in his hand, and began walking toward her with deliberate, measured steps. Panic surged through Amina's body as she scrambled to her feet. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the earth as she tore through the bush. The branches clawed at her skin and clothing, but she didn't dare slow down. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, steady, unhurried, but relentless. "Malam Sani," she cried out, her voice trembling. "Please, I didn't mean to." Her words were cut off by a sharp gasp as she tripped again, this time landing hard on her hands and knees. She turned to see him standing just a few feet away, his tall figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the fire in the distance. His expression was blank, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight into her soul. "Malam, I swear I won't tell anyone," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll keep your secret. Just let me go." But Malam Sani didn't respond. He simply raised the knife, the firelight catching its blade, and took another step toward her. Amina's heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst. She braced herself for the worst, squeezing her eyes shut. Then, a sound pierced the night, a distant shout. "Amina! Amina! Where are you?" It was Bala, her youngest son. The voice startled Malam Sani, who hesitated, his gaze shifting momentarily in the direction of the noise. Amina seized the opportunity and sprang to her feet, running as fast as her legs could carry her. She didn't look back, even as her son's voice grew louder. She burst out of the bush and into the open field where Bala stood, holding a small lantern. The sight of her son filled her with relief, but she didn't stop running until she reached him. She grabbed his hand and began pulling him toward the village. "Mama, what's wrong?" Bala asked, his voice filled with confusion. "No time to explain," she panted. "We need to go. Now." As they hurried back to the safety of their home, Amina glanced over her shoulder. The bush was dark and silent, but she knew Malam Sani was still out there, watching, waiting. That night, as she locked the doors and windows of her small home, she couldn't shake the image of the bloodied sack, the unnatural meat, and the curved knife. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. What had she seen? What was Malam Sani hiding? And most importantly, was her family and the entire village at risk? She knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep this to herself. But who would believe her? Malam Sani was a beloved figure in Jaidan Dawa, his Suya a symbol of the village's identity. If she spoke out without proof, she risked being dismissed as a troublemaker or worse. As she sat in the dim light of her lantern, her children fast asleep, Amina made a silent vow. She would find out the truth about Malam Sani, no matter the cost. The next morning, Amina rose early, her mind still heavy with the horrors of the previous night. She sat by the fire, sipping a bowl of kunu while her children played outside. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Malam Sani, his eerie silence, and the bloodied sack. She had to act quickly, but she needed a plan. Amina decided to confide in her closest friend, Zainab. Zainab was one of the few people in the village who had a sharp intuition and a knack for getting to the bottom of mysteries. If anyone could help her uncover the truth, it was Zainab. Amina waited until mid-morning, when the sun was high and the village was bustling with life. She walked briskly to Zainab's compound, her heart pounding as she rehearsed what she would say. When she arrived, Zainab was outside pounding yam for the afternoon meal. "Amina, you look troubled," Zainab said, setting the pestle aside. "What's wrong?" Amina hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. "Zainab, I need to talk to you. It's about Malam Sani." Zainab raised an eyebrow. "The Suya seller? What about him?" "It's complicated," Amina began, lowering her voice. "I saw something last night. Something I can't explain." Zainab led her into the house and shut the door. "Tell me everything." Amina recounted the events of the night before, from following Malam Sani into the bush to the horrifying moment he spotted her. She described the bloodied sack, the unnatural meat, and the fire-lit clearing. Zainab listened intently, her expression growing darker with every word. When Amina finished, Zainab sat back, her arms crossed. "This is serious, Amina. If what you're saying is true, the entire village could be in danger. But without proof, no one will believe us." "I know," Amina said, her voice trembling. "But what can we do? He's so quiet, so mysterious. Everyone adores his Suya. They'll think I'm crazy." Zainab tapped her fingers on the wooden table, deep in thought. "We need evidence. If we can catch him in the act, the truth will speak for itself." "But how?" Amina asked. "He's so careful. Last night, I barely escaped." Zainab's eyes narrowed. "We'll follow him again, but this time we'll be prepared." That evening, the two women devised a plan. They would wait until the market closed and Malam Sani packed up his stall. Amina would keep watch from a distance while Zainab followed him into the bush, armed with a lantern and a small knife for protection. They hoped to find definitive proof of his activities, something that would convince even the most skeptical villagers. As night fell, Amina and Zainab made their way to the market. The air was filled with the usual chatter of traders closing up their stalls and the tantalizing aroma of Malam Sani's suya. His stall was still surrounded by customers, their faces lit with excitement as they waited for their turn. Amina and Zainab took up positions near a fruit vendor's stall, pretending to chat while keeping a close eye on Malam Sani. His movements were as deliberate as ever, his tall figure looming silently over the fire as he flipped skewers of meat with expert precision. As the crowd began to thin, Amina's stomach tightened. Soon it would be time. When the last customer left and the market grew quiet, Malam Sani extinguished his fire and began packing up his stall. Amina and Zainab exchanged a tense glance. This was it. They watched as he loaded his utensils and spices into a large wooden box and tied it securely to his bicycle. Then, with the same eerie calmness, he wheeled the bicycle out of the market and toward the bush. Zainab nodded to Amina. "I'll follow him. Stay close enough to hear me, but don't let him see you." Amina swallowed hard and nodded. "Be careful." Zainab slipped into the shadows, keeping a safe distance as Malam Sani disappeared into the bush. Amina followed at a slower pace, her heart pounding with every step. The path was dark and unfamiliar, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. After what felt like an eternity, Amina heard a faint rustling ahead. She crouched low, straining her ears. It was Zainab's voice, whispering urgently. "Amina, over here." Amina crept forward and found Zainab hiding behind a cluster of bushes. Zainab motioned for her to stay low and pointed toward a clearing up ahead. Amina peeked through the foliage, and her breath caught in her throat. There was Malam Sani, his fire blazing brightly as he worked. But this time he wasn't alone. A second man stood across from him, holding a large sack. The two men exchanged a few words, though their voices were too low to hear. Then the man opened the sack and dumped its contents onto the ground. Amina clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. The sack had contained a body, a human body. The lifeless form lay sprawled on the ground, its features obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking what it was. Malam Sani bent down and began cutting into the body with his curved knife, his movements disturbingly precise. The other man stood nearby, watching silently. Amina felt her stomach churn as she fought the urge to retch. Beside her, Zainab's face was pale but determined. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small camera. "I'm going to get proof," Zainab whispered. Amina's eyes widened. "Zainab, no. It's too dangerous. We have to," Zainab insisted. "If we don't, no one will believe us." Before Amina could stop her, Zainab raised the camera and began filming. The faint click of the shutter was barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but it felt deafening to Amina. She held her breath, praying that the men wouldn't hear. As Zainab filmed, Malam Sani suddenly stopped and looked up, his head snapping toward their hiding spot. Amina froze, her heart pounding. Had he heard them? The other man said something, and Malam Sani nodded, his expression unreadable. Then, to Amina's horror, he began walking toward them, the knife still in his hand. Amina grabbed Zainab's arm and whispered urgently, "He's coming! We have to go." Zainab hesitated, her camera still clutched tightly in her hand. "Wait, if we run now, he'll know we were watching. We need to move quietly." But there was no time to strategize. Malam Sani's tall, dark figure moved closer, his knife glinting in the firelight. The other man stayed behind, watching the clearing like a silent sentinel. Amina's heart thundered as she scrambled to her feet, pulling Zainab with her. Together, they slipped deeper into the bush, crouching low and moving as silently as they could. The undergrowth scratched at their legs, and every snap of a twig beneath their feet felt deafening. Amina risked a glance over her shoulder and froze. Malam Sani had stopped and was scanning the bushes, his knife gripped tightly in his hand. His eyes, sharp and penetrating, seemed to pierce through the darkness. Zainab nudged Amina and whispered, "Keep going. I'll create a distraction." Amina's eyes widened. "No, I won't leave you. You have to," Zainab insisted, If he catches us both, no one will know the truth. Before Amina could protest, Zainab picked up a small rock and hurled it into the bushes on the opposite side of the clearing. The rustling sound drew Malam Sani's attention. He turned sharply and began moving toward the noise, his footsteps eerily quiet. Zainab motioned for Amina to keep moving. Reluctantly, Amina nodded and crept away, her chest tight with fear. She navigated through the dense foliage, her heart pounding in her ears. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant call of an owl, and the faint rustling of the wind. But she kept moving, determined to escape and protect the evidence they had gathered. After what felt like an eternity, Amina finally emerged from the bush and onto the main path leading back to the village. She paused to catch her breath, her mind racing. Where was Zainab? Had she made it out? Or had Malam Sani caught her? Amina's instincts screamed at her to run back and help her friend. But she knew Zainab had risked everything to give her a chance to escape. If she went back and got caught, all their efforts would be in vain. Clutching her pounding chest, Amina ran toward Zainab's compound. When she arrived, she found Zainab's younger brother, Musa, sitting outside, chewing on a sugarcane. Musa, Amina gasped, doubling over to catch her breath. Where is your mother? Musa looked up, startled by her frantic tone. She's inside. What happened? Tell her to lock the door and stay inside, Amina said urgently. And if Zainab comes back, don't let her leave again. Musa frowned, clearly confused, but nodded. Okay, I'll tell her. Amina didn't wait for a response. She needed to find help, and there was only one person in the village she could trust, Malam Waziri, the retired hunter who had spent years tracking dangerous animals and bandits in the surrounding forests. If anyone could help, it was him. She sprinted to Malam Waziri's hut, her legs aching and her lungs burning. When she arrived, she banged on the wooden door, her hands trembling. The door creaked open, and Malam Waziri peered out, his weathered face etched with concern. Amina? What's the matter? Malam Waziri, she panted. It's Malam Sani. He's doing something terrible in the bush. He has a knife and Zainab is still out there. The hunter's eyes narrowed, and he grabbed his bow and quiver of arrows from inside the hut. Stay here, he said firmly. I'll find Zainab and bring her back. No, Amina protested. I'm coming with you. Malam Waziri hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but stay close and don't make a sound. The two of them set off into the night, following the path back to the clearing. Amina's fear clawed at her, but she pushed it aside. Zainab needed her. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Malam Waziri held up a hand, signaling for Amina to stop. Together, they crouched behind a large tree and peered into the clearing. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the scene. Malam Sani and the other man were standing near the remains of the body, their voices low and urgent. Zainab was nowhere to be seen. Malam Waziri's grip tightened on his bow. Stay here, he whispered to Amina. He crept forward, his movements silent and precise. Amina watched anxiously as he disappeared into the shadows. She held her breath, praying he wouldn't be discovered. Suddenly, there was a loud rustling in the bushes. Malam Sani turned sharply, his knife raised. But before he could react, Malam Waziri stepped into the clearing, his bow drawn and an arrow pointed directly at the Suya seller. Drop the knife, Waziri commanded, his voice steady. The other man bolted into the bush, but Malam Sani didn't flinch. He stood tall, his expression unreadable, and slowly lowered the knife. For a moment it seemed as though he would comply. But then, without warning, he lunged at Waziri with terrifying speed. Waziri released the arrow, and it struck Malam Sani in the shoulder. The Suya seller let out a low growl, an inhuman sound that sent chills down Amina's spine. He stumbled but didn't fall, his dark eyes burning with rage. Run, Amina, Waziri shouted. Amina hesitated, torn between fleeing and staying to help. But when Malam Sani turned his gaze toward her, she felt a surge of fear and bolted into the night. As she ran, she heard the sounds of a struggle behind her. The clash of metal, the rustling of leaves, and Waziri's voice shouting commands. Tears streamed down her face as she prayed for his safety, for Zainab's safety, and for the nightmare to end. When she finally reached the edge of the village, she collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion and terror. She looked back toward the dark forest, her heart aching for her friends. The truth about Malam Sani was darker than she had ever imagined, and the fight to expose him was far from over. Amina paced back and forth at the edge of the village, her chest tight with worry. The distant sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the occasional chirp of a nocturnal bird, felt oppressive, like the forest itself was hiding something sinister. She wanted to run back, to find Malam Waziri and Zainab, but her legs trembled with exhaustion and fear. She needed to tell someone, anyone, but who would believe her? The village was still quiet, with most of the residents asleep. Amina hurried to Zainab's compound, hoping her friend had somehow made it back. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding. Musa opened it cautiously, his wide eyes filled with hope. "Did you find her?" he asked. Amina shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "No. But Malam Waziri is out there looking for her. We need to stay here and wait." Musa hesitated but nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Inside, Zainab's mother sat on a mat, her hands clasped in silent prayer. When she saw Amina, her face lit up with desperate expectation. "Did you see Zainab?" she asked, her voice shaky. "No, Mama," Amina admitted, her voice breaking. "But she's strong. She'll come back." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. She settled on the floor next to Musa, gripping her knees tightly as her mind raced through the events of the night. Malam Sani, his knife, the fire, the body, and the other man who had run off. Who was he? What were they planning? And, most importantly, what had they done to Zainab? Time dragged on, each passing second an eternity. Amina's body was heavy with exhaustion, but sleep refused to come. Just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the door, there was a knock. Everyone froze. Amina's heart leapt into her throat as she scrambled to her feet. Musa rushed to the door and opened it cautiously. Standing there, battered but alive, was Malam Waziri. He held Zainab by the arm, helping her walk. Her face was pale, and her clothes were torn, but she was alive. "Zainab!" Amina cried, running to embrace her friend. Tears streamed down her face as she clung to her. I thought. Zainab winced but managed a weak smile. "I'm okay. Malam Waziri found me just in time." Inside the house, Zainab's mother fell to her knees, sobbing in relief. Musa ran to fetch water as they helped Zainab sit down. Malam Waziri, still holding his bow, leaned against the wall, his face grim. "What happened?" Amina asked, her voice trembling. Zainab took a shaky breath. I hid in the bushes after you left. Malam Sani was close, but he didn't find me. When Malam Waziri arrived, he fought him off. The other man ran away. Malam Waziri nodded. "He's injured, but he escaped. I tried to track him, but the forest is vast, and I didn't want to leave Zainab alone." Amina's mind swirled with questions, but one burned brighter than the rest. "Zainab, did you get it? The evidence?" Zainab nodded weakly and held up her camera. "It's all here." A wave of relief washed over Amina. The villagers would finally see the truth. But then a new fear took hold. Would they even believe them? Malam Waziri seemed to read her thoughts. "The evidence is strong," he said. "But Malam Sani is not just any man. He's feared and respected in this village. Convincing the people won't be easy." Amina clenched her fists. "We have to try. We can't let him get away with this." By the time the sun fully rose, the news of Zainab's return and her harrowing escape had begun to spread. Curious neighbors gathered outside the compound, whispering among themselves. Amina knew it was only a matter of time before Malam Sani found out they were back. Determined to act quickly, Amina, Zainab, and Malam Waziri went to the village chief's house. The chief, an elderly man with a stern face and a booming voice, listened as they explained everything that had happened. "You're accusing Malam Sani of murder?" The chief asked, his tone skeptical. Do you realize the weight of such an accusation? Yes, Your Highness, Amina said firmly. We have proof. Zainab recorded everything. Zainab handed the camera to the chief, her hands trembling. He watched the footage in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing second. By the time he finished, his face was pale. This, he began, his voice unsteady. This is a grave matter. It's not just one body, Malam Waziri said. I found signs of more graves in the clearing. He's been at this for a long time. The chief stood, his hands shaking as he placed the camera on his desk. We must gather the elders and confront him immediately. If what you say is true, Malam Sani has brought great evil upon this village. But as the chief began issuing orders to his guards, a commotion erupted outside. Amina ran to the door and peered out, her blood running cold at the sight. Malam Sani stood in the middle of the village square, his arm bandaged from the arrow wound, his face calm and composed. Around him, a group of his loyal customers and supporters had gathered, shouting in his defense. They're lying, one man yelled. Malam Sani has been feeding this village for years. Why would he harm us? Do you have any proof? Another demanded, glaring at Amina and Zainab as they emerged from the chief's compound. Amina's voice trembled with anger. We do. It's all on the camera. She held up the device, but Malam Sani's calm gaze locked onto hers, sending a shiver down her spine. He took a step forward, his voice low but carrying an edge that silenced the crowd. These girls are spreading lies, he said, his tone measured. I have served this village faithfully. If they have proof, let them show it. Amina hesitated, realizing the gravity of the moment. The crowd's eyes bore into her, some filled with doubt, others with hostility. She looked to Zainab, who nodded, urging her to press play. As the footage played, gasps rippled through the crowd. The scene of the lifeless body, the bloodied knife, and the eerie clearing filled with shadows was undeniable. Murmurs of disbelief and horror spread among the villagers. But just as the evidence seemed to sway the crowd, one of Malam Sani's supporters stepped forward. This proves nothing, he shouted. Where's the body now? Anyone could have staged this to ruin Malam Sani's name. The crowd's doubt began to grow again, and Amina felt a pang of despair. How could they still defend him after everything? Malam Waziri stepped forward, his voice firm. Enough! I've seen the clearing with my own eyes. If you want proof, I'll take you there. The chief nodded. We'll send a group to investigate immediately. If they find the graves, Malam Sani will have to answer for his crimes. Malam Sani's calm facade finally cracked. His eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a sneer. You won't find anything, he said coldly. And when you don't, I will expect an apology. Amina's heart pounded as the crowd dispersed to follow Malam Waziri to the clearing. She watched Malam Sani retreat to his stall, his dark figure looming like a shadow over the village. She knew the fight was far from over, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Malam Sani still had more secrets to reveal. The group of villagers, led by Malam Waziri and accompanied by the chief's guards, moved cautiously through the forest. The tension in the air was palpable, their steps heavy with uncertainty. Amina and Zainab stayed close together, their breaths shallow as they approached the clearing where the horrifying events had taken place. The early morning light pierced through the dense foliage, casting long shadows on the forest floor. As they reached the spot, Amina's heart sank. The clearing, which had been marked by the shallow graves and eerie remains just the night before, was now disturbingly clean. The earth was undisturbed, and the air, once heavy with the smell of charred flesh and blood, was eerily fresh. Gasps of confusion and murmurs rippled through the group. There's nothing here, someone whispered. Where are the graves? Amina's stomach churned as doubt began to creep into the villagers' faces. She turned to Malam Waziri, who was kneeling by the ground, inspecting the area. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. The graves were here. I saw them. One of Malam Sani's supporters, who had tagged along, smirked. You see? They're lying. There's no evidence of any wrongdoing here. No! Amina shouted, her voice trembling. We saw it. Zainab filmed it. He must have moved everything overnight. The supporter sneered. You expect us to believe Malam Sani dug up bodies and cleaned this entire clearing in a few hours? Your story is falling apart. Amina's fists clenched as the villagers began murmuring again, their doubt turning into skepticism. Even the chief's guards exchanged uneasy glances. Malam Waziri stood, his face set in a grim line. The camera footage is undeniable. This is his doing. He's trying to cover his tracks. One of the guards stepped forward. Without physical evidence, it's hard to convince the villagers. Amina's frustration boiled over. Do you really think we'd make this up? Zainab and I risked our lives to expose him. Zainab, still pale and weak, managed to speak. Please believe us. Malam Sani is dangerous. If we don't stop him, more people will suffer. But the crowd's doubt was growing. The absence of physical proof had shaken their trust. As the group began to retreat from the forest, Amina felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. Malam Sani had outmaneuvered them, and now the villagers were questioning everything. When they returned to the village, Malam Sani was waiting for them, standing tall in the marketplace. His loyal supporters surrounded him, their faces smug with triumph. Well, he asked, his voice calm but dripping with menace. Did you find your so-called graves? The chief stepped forward, his expression unreadable. There was nothing there. No graves. No bodies. A ripple of relief and satisfaction spread through Malam Sani's supporters. Amina's voice cracked as she shouted, You moved them. You knew we'd come. Malam Sani shook his head, his tone condescending. Accusations without proof are just words. Child, you've tarnished my name and wasted the chief's time. The villagers murmured among themselves, their faith in Amina and Zainab wavering. Some even turned to Malam Sani with apologetic looks. One of the elders stepped forward. Enough of this nonsense. Malam Sani has been a pillar of this village. These girls have no proof beyond their wild stories. Let this end. Malam Sani turned to the chief, his expression calm. I demand an apology, Your Highness, for this baseless attack on my character. The chief hesitated, his gaze flicking to Amina and Zainab. For a moment, hope flickered in Amina's chest, but then the chief sighed and nodded. Malam Sani, he said, his voice heavy, I apologize for this misunderstanding. You are free to continue your business. Amina's heart shattered. She turned to the crowd, her voice desperate. You're making a mistake. He's dangerous. Please, listen to us. But the villagers began to disperse, their trust in Malam Sani seemingly unshaken. As Malam Sani's supporters cheered, he turned his cold gaze to Amina. You should learn when to stop, girl, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Keep pushing, and you'll regret it. A chill ran down Amina's spine as she watched him walk away, his supporters trailing behind him like shadows. That night, Amina and Zainab sat with Malam Waziri in his small hut, their spirits broken. The village had turned against them, and Malam Sani's threat loomed large. He's won, Zainab said quietly, tears streaming down her face. No one will believe us now. Malam Waziri's eyes were dark with determination. Not yet. He may have silenced the villagers, but we still have the footage. We need to take this beyond the village. Amina's brows furrowed. Beyond the village? You mean, the city? He nodded. If we can get this to the authorities in the city, they'll investigate. They won't be fooled by his tricks. The thought filled Amina with a glimmer of hope. But it was quickly overshadowed by fear. Malam Sani wouldn't let them leave so easily. He'll come after us, she said. If he finds out we're going to the city, Malam Waziri placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Then we'll have to be smart. We leave before dawn, quietly. He won't know until it's too late. As they planned their escape, Amina felt a renewed sense of purpose. Malam Sani might have won the villagers over, but she wouldn't let his crimes go unpunished. Together, they would bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Malam Sani was always one step ahead, and she feared what he might do to stop them. The night was unervingly quiet as Amina, Zainab, and Malam Waziri prepared to leave for the city. The weight of their mission pressed heavily on their shoulders. In the darkness, they packed the video evidence, some food, and water into a small bag. Malam Waziri had borrowed an old bicycle cart from a neighbor to make the journey easier, knowing the trek through the dense forest to the main road would be long and dangerous. "We have to leave now," Malam Waziri whispered. "The longer we stay, the more time Malam Sani has to stop us." Amina glanced around nervously as they slipped out of the hut. The village was cloaked in shadows, the usual noises of crickets and distant voices replaced by an unsettling stillness. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them. They made their way down the narrow dirt paths, the wheels of the cart crunching softly against the ground. Zainab clung tightly to Amina's arm, her fear evident in her trembling fingers. "I don't trust this silence," Zainab whispered. "It feels wrong." Amina nodded, her heart pounding. She kept her eyes on the forest ahead, scanning for any movement. They had barely made it past the outskirts of the village when a chilling sound froze them in their tracks. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. Malam Waziri held up a hand, signaling them to stop. "Stay close," he said, his voice barely audible. It could be an animal, but deep down they all knew it wasn't. The growling grew louder, and suddenly, shadows shifted in the moonlight. From the darkness, 3 large, snarling dogs emerged, their eyes glowing unnaturally red. Their teeth bared, they circled the group, their growls vibrating through the air like thunder. "Malam Sani's hounds," Malam Waziri muttered, his face grim. "He sent them after us." Amina's pulse raced as the dogs edged closer, their sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. Malam Waziri reached into his bag and pulled out a handful of ground pepper. He threw it toward the dogs, hoping to deter them. The dogs yelped and retreated momentarily, but their fury only seemed to grow. "They won't stop," Zainab whimpered. "What do we do?" "Run," Malam Waziri said, his voice firm. "Now!" The group sprinted down the path, the dogs barking and snarling as they gave chase. Amina's lungs burned as she ran, her legs aching with every step. Zainab stumbled, but Amina grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. Behind them, Malam Waziri shouted, "Keep going! Don't stop!" The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees casting twisted shadows in the dim light. The sound of the dogs grew louder, closer, their relentless pursuit echoing in the night. Just when it seemed the dogs would overtake them, Malam Waziri stopped abruptly. He turned to face the hounds, his expression resolute. "Go," he shouted to Amina and Zainab. "I'll hold them off." "No," Amina cried, skidding to a stop. "We can't leave you." "There's no time to argue," he snapped. "Take the evidence and get to the city. It's the only way to stop him." Before they could protest further, Malam Waziri pulled out a small charm from his pocket, a protective amulet given to him by the village's old herbalist. He held it up and began chanting, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The hounds hesitated, snarling and pacing, as if an invisible barrier had been erected between them and Malam Waziri. Amina and Zainab exchanged a tearful glance, but they knew they had no choice. Clutching the bag tightly, they turned and ran, leaving Malam Waziri behind. The path ahead was treacherous, filled with roots and uneven ground. Amina's heart ached as she heard the distant growls and Malam Waziri's shouts fading behind them. She prayed silently for his safety as she and Zainab pressed on. After what felt like hours, they finally emerged from the forest onto the main road. The faint glow of the city lights on the horizon filled them with a renewed sense of hope. "We're almost there," Amina said breathlessly, though her legs felt like they could give out at any moment. But as they started down the road, a figure stepped out from the shadows ahead. Malam Sani. He stood tall and imposing, his dark robe billowing in the night breeze. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and a cruel smile played on his lips. "Well, well," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Did you really think you could escape me?" Zainab shrank back, her hand clutching Amina's arm. How did he get here so fast?" Amina's mind raced. They had the footage, but Malam Sani was right in front of them, blocking their path to the city. "You won't stop us," Amina said, her voice trembling but defiant. "We have the evidence. The truth will come out." Malam Sani chuckled darkly. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery won't save you." With a wave of his hand, the air around them grew heavy, and a chilling wind swept through the road. Shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing as they surrounded Amina and Zainab. Amina gritted her teeth, clutching the bag tightly. "We won't let you win." She reached into the bag and pulled out the phone, holding it up as if it were a shield. The screen glowed faintly, showing the footage they had risked everything to capture. Malam Sani's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "That won't save you." But Amina noticed something in his expression. Fear. The footage was his weakness, the one thing that could expose him for what he truly was. Gathering her courage, Amina took a step forward. "You're afraid of the truth," she said. "You know this will destroy you." Malam Sani's hands clenched into fists, and the shadows around him grew darker, more menacing. But Amina refused to back down. "You can't stop the truth," she said, her voice steady. "No matter what you do, it will come out." Suddenly, a blinding light illuminated the road. Amina shielded her eyes, and when she looked up, she saw headlights approaching. A car sped toward them, its horn blaring as it skidded to a stop. Two men stepped out, their uniforms identifying them as city police officers. "What's going on here?" one of them demanded, his flashlight sweeping over the scene. Malam Sani's expression twisted into rage, but he quickly masked it with a calm facade. "These girls are causing trouble," he said smoothly. "I was simply trying to stop them." Amina stepped forward, her voice firm. "He's lying. He's the one causing trouble. We have proof." She handed the phone to the officer, her hands shaking. The officer played the video, his expression growing darker with every passing second. "This is horrifying," he said. He turned to Malam Sani, his eyes hard. "You're coming with us." Malam Sani's calm demeanor cracked, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he snarled. But the officers were unfazed. They restrained him, ignoring his threats and curses as they led him to the car. Amina and Zainab stood in stunned silence, their ordeal finally coming to an end. Tears streamed down their faces as they realized they had done it. They had exposed Malam Sani and brought him to justice. As the car drove away, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the road in golden light. Amina turned to Zainab, her heart heavy but filled with hope. "It's over," she said softly. "We did it." Zainab nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. "We did." Together, they began the long walk to the city, ready to ensure Malam Sani's evil would never harm anyone again.